how trade led to battles. As we discussed earlier, to remove competition, of course, the different companies, they started to battle against each other. So there were also battles among the Indian rulers and the East India Company. So after the death of Alivardi, Sirajuddaulah, he became the Nawab of Bengal. So the areas of conflict between Bengal Nawabs and the East India Company. So of course the East India Company first set up its feet and its root in Bengal. So there had to be some conflict. There was always conflict between the local zamindars, subedars and rulers with the East India Company. So what were the places and the areas of conflict? Why was there a conflict which resulted into big battles? So the areas of conflict between Nawabs of Bengal and East India Company were that the requests to grant concessions to the company. There were requests to grant concessions to the company, reason being that they needed a fair trade. So the Nawabs of Bengal and Bengal was suffering from a loss of revenue because the East India Company, it was allowed to trade duty free and they were manipulating the market. So there were requests to grant concessions. Now, apart from that, there was a demand of large tributes from the company for right to trade. The company, they started to actually demand huge amount of tributes and taxes in terms of right of trade. Apart from that, there was a denial of right to minting, which is making coins. Of course, it's not like nobody can produce currency. You and I, we cannot produce currency. It has to be under the government, under the ruler, isn't it? So what was the major conflict? That they were, the East India Company, they did not have the right to mint coins, to make coins, of course. Stoppage of fortification expansion. The East India Company, they wanted to build forts and do fortification around the factories in order to protect their commodities. But this was denied and it was stopped because that meant that the power was being given to the East India Company then to the local rulers. So the Nawabs, they claimed that the company was depriving the Bengal government of amount of revenue. So there must be some amount of revenue which was not being given to the Bengal government in terms of fair trade. So the East India Company, they started undermining the authority of Nawab. They started capturing areas. They started their own rules and policies. They started dictating their own policy and trade making system. So they were in a way undermining or overruling the authority of the Nawabs. Amidst all these conflicts, there were few actions which were taken by the company. So let's see what are these actions. They refused the payment of taxes to the government or to the Nawabs. The company, they totally refused to pay any kind of taxes to the government. So apart from that, they started to write disrespectful letters. So they were always undermining and disrespecting the authorities of the native and local rulers. Apart from that, they tried to humiliate the Nawabs and the officials. Enlargement of settlements were taking place by the company. They started to settle in areas without any prior information and permission from the Nawabs. Apart from that, they started buying villages because they had a lot of money. They started to buy villages and they started to rebuild the forts even when it was stopped by the Nawabs. So these were few totally out of hand things and activities and actions that were done and taken by the company, which resulted in huge long lasting conflicts between the native rulers and the Nawabs and the East India Company. Now, after the death of Aurangzeb, as Aurangzeb died, the Bengal Nawabs, they started to assert more power and autonomy. That was necessary also because the operations of East India Company, they were getting out of hand. Other regional powers were doing the same thing. The Bengal, Murshid Quli Khan was followed by Alivardi Khan and then Sirajuddaulah. As the Nawabs of Bengal, they started to control and assert their own power so that they could manage and become strong rulers. So, trade led to battle. So, as you see that there were conflicts between the company and the Nawabs, there was a long lasting list of actions which were quite disrespectful at the part of the company. So, it resulted in long battles. So, let's have a look. In the beginning of the 18th century, the conflict between the company and the Nawabs, it grew out of hand. It was intensified to a level that it completely became out of hand. Murshid Quli Khan, Ali Vardi Khan and Sijarudullah, they proved to be the strong rulers in the province of Bengal. They refused to grant the company concessions. So what did they do? They refused any kind of concessions to the company. They did not grant any kind of concessions, trade concessions or duty-free trade to them. So they also denied the right to mint coins. They were not allowed to make coins anymore. So they stopped it from extending the fortification. So these are the three important things that these Bengali rulers, these Nawabs, they implemented on the East India Company. So they accused the company of deceit and claimed that the company was depriving Bengal of some kind of revenue. Of course, they were not paying taxes. The company was not paying taxes. So the government revenue or the revenue which had to be gone to the state, it was being decreased. So there was a deprivation. The Nawabs, they also stated that the company, they were undermining the authority, the power and the respect of the Nawabs in Bengal. So this was one thing which totally resulted in battles and conflict, and it intensified over a period of time. The company, they refused to pay taxes. They wrote disrespectful notes and letters and tried to completely humiliate the Nawabs. The company realized that trade could not flourish if the duties were removed. So it was not just that the duties had to be removed in order to flourish and increase the trade, but there were other factors also. It was also convinced that to expand the trade, to develop and grow their trade and business, it had to enlarge settlement, land, etc. So they started building up and buying villages, and they started to build and rebuild the fortification and forts. These conflicts led to confrontations and finally culminated in the famous Battle of Plassey. So here you need to note one important thing. There were a lot of things that were happening. There were conflicts due to several reasons that we discussed earlier. Apart from that, they started to expand and enlarge its settlements. They started to build up villages and rebuild forts. This resulted in confrontations and led to the famous Battle of Plassey. So now you know why Battle of Plassey was fought.